local access, Channel 29, exclusive programming for Comcast subscribers.
Hello, welcome to Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and you're watching a program sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. Religion, science, why are they at conflict, or should they be at conflict? Evolution, creationism, intelligent design. What is evolution? And why does evolution cause so much strife in the minds of some people in terms of teaching evolution as a theory in the public high school science class? I want to call your attention to something called Science Under Siege, the attack on evolution. This is going to be a panel discussion, and everybody is invited. It's free, it's open to the public. It's going to be held at the University of North Florida on Monday, November 13th from 7 o'clock until 9:30 p.m. It's at the University Center at UNF, which is Building 43. And the good news about the University Center is that there's free parking at the UNF, free parking and plenty of it at the University Center. And look at some of these guests panelist discussions. There's going to be Anthony M. Rossi, Dr. Rossi, he's a biologist, teaches at UNF. Matthew Gillig, Jay Humer, a physicist and an astronomer. Gordon Rakita, an anthropologist. And the moderator is going to be yours truly, Ken Hurley, the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. And with us in studio to discuss the attack on evolution and science under siege is Dr. Tony Rossi. Doctor, I'm so happy you took time to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the basic question. What is evolution?
Evolution is effectively the gradual change in genotype, which is the genetic makeup and the physical makeup of organisms over time, in which eventually new species descend from earlier species. That's what evolution is. And then there's a series of arguments that go into what's called the theory of evolution that explain how that happens.
A theory of evolution. A theory is an interesting word when you look it up in Webster's. Webster's, I think, is part of the source of confusion in some sense, because the layperson often confuses the scientific word theory with the word hypothesis.
That's correct.
Can you explain a little bit what that is? Why is the word theory used to explain evolution?
Yeah, in the common vernacular, theory and hypotheses are often used interchangeably, but a theory in science is much broader and not equivalent to a hypothesis in science. Hypothesis is usually limited to a very small question that we can collect data for and test and answer the question whether or not that phenomenon is likely to be supported by the data. A theory, on the other hand, involves a series of related hypotheses. They're much more complex. All of the related hypotheses have to be supported by the evidence, and there are actually relatively few theories in science. For instance, I was trying to come up with the theories the other day that I could come up with in science, and I could come up with the atomic theory, the genetic theory, the theory of gravity, and the theory of evolution. So
theory of relativity?
Theory of relativity, which is, again, a modern view of the explanation of gravity that was put forward by Newton. So we have Newton's theory of gravity, which is a series of mathematical equations that explain how gravity occurs. And then we have Einstein's more modern view of gravity, which is the theory of relativity. And
But in terms of hypothesis and theory, you used the word hypothesis in science.
That's correct.
Right? When we learned the scientific method in 9th grade science
That's
class,
correct.
we were taught that you start with hypothesis and then you progress to a theory. Hypothesis is an idea which may or may not be testable. Is that correct?
A hypothesis, according to science, must always be testable. If a hypothesis is not testable, that is, if one cannot perform experiments or collect data to test the evidence for that hypothesis, then it's not science. And therein lies part of the problem with creationism and intelligent design. The central tenet of the theory, and I'm saying theory in the common vernacular sense, of creationism or intelligent design is the existence of God, and that's not testable by science.
Why not?
Because science has to collect data from the experiential world, that is, things that we can actually collect and verify. And again, God is outside of the supernatural world. So it's not that science or a belief in evolution or recognition of evolution negates God. Science is fundamentally agnostic. It can't address the question of God, whether God exists or doesn't exist.
You say God is outside of the supernatural world?
No, God is outside of the natural world.
And
God is supernatural.
Yes.
Yes.
But in any way, does evolution disprove the existence of God or seek to disprove the existence of God?
No, that's certainly not the goal of evolution. Again, evolution is a theory based on arguments to explain the data from molecular biology to geology to immunology to comparative biology. So it's not, I've lost my point here.
Well, that's fine. Let's move on to whether or not evolution can ever be completely proven.
No, nothing in science can ever be completely proven.
And isn't that the tenet of theory?
Well, no. Well, what we can do in science is we disprove things because science is based on statistical probabilities. So, for instance, we can't prove that evolution occurs, just like we don't prove anything in science. Science advances by disproving false hypotheses. And an important distinction to make regarding science is that when science makes predictions, which all good science should be capable of doing is making predictions, those predictions can be forward predictions or they can be predictions made of a past event. So for instance, we can look at organisms today, look at their genetic sequences and make predictions as to what the sequences might be in an ancestral species, for instance.
Let's look at some bacteria.
Okay.
And the antibiotics that we have created to help us with some of the diseases of the 20th century and 21st century. Is it a fact that the bacteria evolve and adapt to our antibiotics? Most
definitely it's a fact. And there are many examples of organisms actually exhibiting evolution in our lifetime. These are what we call microevolutionary changes. That is, changes that are on a small scale, but changes that are observable over our lifetime. And so for instance, there are rats which are now resistant to warfarin, which is a common poison used to kill rats because they've developed resistance to it. There are bacteria now that are completely resistant to penicillin or other antibiotics. So clearly we can actually demonstrate and witness these small changes in our lifetime. What's difficult and what's hard for people to relate to is that we can still infer changes over longer periods of time, but when evolution takes place over thousands of years and our lifespan is, say, 80 years, we're not going to see the whole picture. We're going to get little bits and pieces, and then we have to look for the evidence to fill in the blanks. It's sort of like solving a murder. Even if no one was there to witness it, you can still collect evidence for that murder and still find a likely suspect for the crime. It doesn't mean that someone has to be there to witness it, which is a common misconception of a lot of creationists, that no one was there to witness it, therefore we can't make any sorts of predictions.
Does evolution have flaws in the theory?
Oh, of course. All theories in science have flaws. If they didn't, we'd stop testing them. And the beauty of evolutionary theory is that it's so robust. We've been testing evolutionary theory for close to 150 years now, and the debate amongst biologists isn't whether evolution is occurring. There's no debate amongst biologists who practice in the field. The debate is upon which mechanism is more important in driving the evolution. So since the time of Darwin, we found other mechanisms that can cause evolutions in populations. So it's a very robust model, and he's largely seems to be supported. Unlike most theories 150 years old, they've had to been greatly modified. His is largely intact. One of the arguments that I hear often is about the human eye. How could something so complex simply just evolve? Right. How do you respond to that? Well, humans probably were formed fully with their eyes, but you can see the evolution of the eye through the fossil record, and you can actually see it in living organisms today. For instance, many vertebrates are blind. They have no eyes. Some organisms have simple 1 or 2 cells, which are small pigmented spots that can pick up light or dark differences. Others have more complicated eyes. So you can see the entire gradation of eyes in living organisms today, and you can also see the progression of eyes in part through the fossil record. Now, clearly the fossil record is incomplete because the circumstances that allow organisms to become fossilized are very rare. So the fact that we have as many fossils as we do is really amazing, and they fill in the blanks very nicely.
But you welcome the scrutiny of evolution. That's your job as a matter of fact. You are a biologist, and when you say in the field, you're literally in the field.
That's right. That's right.
Talk a little bit about the field in which you practice your work.
One of my areas of interest is evolutionary biology, and in particular, my students and I are looking at research, conducting research investigating whether or not populations of a little midge are actually diverging or speciating right now. So we're trying to see.
What is a little midge?
A little midge is
there such thing as a big midge?
Actually, there are big midges, but this is a small midge about the size of a mosquito, and my students and I are conducting research to see if
those are little things that bite you.
They don't bite. These aren't mosquitoes, so they don't bite at all. These are actually, these don't even feed as adults. So they only attack plants, and they cause a little tumor on the plants. And my students are investigating whether or not they're actually diverging along host plant lines. That is, the populations on different plants are now evolving differences enough to where they're becoming new species.
Are you actually observing this in the field?
Well, when I say observing, we're doing it through looking at genetic sequences. So by observing, we're collecting insects from the field, from the different plants, and we're looking to see whether or not the genetic sequences are consistent with an evolutionary pattern.
So where is your field? Is it in Jacksonville?
Yeah, our field sites are right here in Jacksonville along the coast. These are native insects that attack 3 native host plants, so it's very convenient, and it's a great example of looking at possible evolutionary mechanisms right here in the First Coast.
And you teach this at UNF?
I don't teach. I teach a class called the Debate Between Evolution and Creation Science, but I don't teach so much about my own personal research. That's sort of a separate issue. But it gets integrated a little bit into my teaching.
Well, one of the things that we hear is that evolution is the reason we know, and I put that in quotes because I think you're going to challenge what I'm going to say, that we evolved from monkeys and apes, we being the humans. Is that true or not true, or is that a misconception relative to evolution? Did humans evolve from the monkeys?
Certainly the evidence suggests that our lineage, the human family, the hominids, have evolved or branched off from the old world monkeys. And the old world monkeys are the monkeys that we find in places like Africa. And there are monkeys, of course, in the Western Hemisphere in places like South and Central America, but those are called New World monkeys. And those diverged from our branch of the evolutionary tree when South America split off from Africa as the plates separated and the continents moved apart. So the evidence suggests that our closest ancestors, if you look at the genetic sequences, are chimpanzees. And chimpanzees, again, are old world monkeys, and we share more of our genes in common with chimpanzees than chimpanzees share in common with gorillas. So, and again, gorillas are another type of old world monkey. So clearly the evidence suggests that our closest living relatives are the great apes, which are a type of old world monkey. And then if the next closest relatives would be things like orangutans, which are a little bit more distant genetically, and then you would get into things like baboons, and other old world monkeys would be more distantly related.
We use the word gene as if everybody understands what that is. What is a gene, and how is it spelled? It's not J-E-A-N.
No, it's G-E-N-E, and a gene is a region of DNA, the genetic material.
What is DNA?
It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. This is the alphabet that contains the genetic sequence or the code to produce you or me or an oak tree. So this is the region that contains the heritability or the traits that can be passed on from one generation to the next.
How do we know this?
Because we can actually go in and express those genes individually to produce their products, and we can manipulate genes by changing the sequence, just like nature can do, except we can do it artificially through genetic recombination and genetic engineering.
Well, we're going to take a short break.
Okay.
When we come back, I want to follow up on more on evolution, what it is. We'll talk a little bit about this character, Darwin, that we hear so much about and why he's causing so much trouble. And maybe we can talk a little bit about Galileo and see what happened with him. But in the meantime, I want you guys to watch this. There's a few short messages coming up. You're watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley, and we're talking about evolution with Dr. Tony Rossi, professor of biology over at the University of North Florida. Take a look at this. We'll be right back.
This This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
In these turbulent times, let us not erode the liberties our country was built on.
Let it shine.
Larry Parker, National Honor Society student. Patricia Stevenson, stockbroker. Hector DeSario, systems analyst. Driving while black or brown isn't a crime. If it's happened to you, call us at 1-877-6-PROFILE and arrest the racism.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse. We're talking with Dr. Tony Rossi about evolution, science in the classroom, creationism. I want to talk about Darwin now and a little bit about intelligent design, but I also want to remind you about a program coming up over at the University of North Florida. It's called Science Under Siege. It's a panel discussion. It's going to be a lively Q&A. Science Under Siege is the attack on evolution, Monday, November 13th, from 7 o'clock to 9:30 p.m. at the University Center at UNF. And there's free parking and plenty of it. Discover the importance of teaching evolutionary theory in the classroom. This is free. It's open to the public. Everybody is invited to be there. And the best part is when the experts stop speaking and the questions come from the audience, and that's when we get into a very good discussion. And yours truly has been invited to be the moderator at Science Under Siege on Monday, November 13th at the University Center, UNF. And this is hosted by the First Coast Free Thought Society and the University of North Florida. And you can see more about the First Coast Free Thought Society by going to their webpage, which is firstcoastfreethoughtsociety.org. Science Under Siege. I actually hope to see you there. And if you are there, please introduce yourself to me. I'd love to meet you. Let's get back to evolution. Who started this discussion about evolution? Did this come from this guy, Darwin? Is he the one that's causing all the trouble 150 years after?
Yeah, well, he's the one who gets credit for coming up with a coherent, testable, and remember, that's the key to science, a testable theory of evolution in which the mechanism could be tested. Although he wasn't the sole developer of the evolutionary theory, there's another Englishman by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, who's actually a co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, or co-developer, and actually predates Darwin. The first testable mechanism of evolutionary theory actually traces back to a Frenchman by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who is a predecessor of Darwin's, who developed a theory called evolution by acquired characteristics. His theory was incorrect because the mechanism was not supported by scientific experiments, but we remember him, or at least we remember him in my classes, because he developed the first testable theory of evolution, and that's the key to science, even though it was wrong.
Well, but then you moved on from that.
That's exactly right. That's
they
right.
looked at it, they didn't understand it, they tested it.
That's right.
And they could definitively prove it not to be a valid theory.
That's right. Science can disprove theories that are hypotheses that are incorrect. It just can't prove any theory beyond it, or
the
hypothesis.
theories are never totally proven correct.
That's correct. That is correct.
And that's okay. So is evolution a random process?
The environment is largely a random process, but evolution is a very non-random process. Once the environmental factors or the biological factors that are influencing a population of organisms are in place, then those are very non-random processes. For instance, if you had a population of frogs and suddenly the environment became much wetter and you've got a degree of webbing between the fingers of the frogs, one would predict, if evolutionary theory is correct, that over time frogs with more webbing in their toes should predominate in the population because they would escape predators more effectively, they would be able to swim faster through the water to catch prey, and if the environment dried, we would predict that frogs with less webbing would be the predominant frogs in the population, because it's easier to walk on land without webbing between your toes than it is with webbing. So we can certainly make testable predictions and actually go out in the field and see if they are supported by the data.
Well, talk a little bit about sex.
Okay.
how does sex play in the role of evolution? I mean, do species interbreed and then create a new species? Is that how it happens?
Well, that's a possibility, but the more common way we believe that species occur is that a small population or maybe a slightly bigger branch of a main population becomes isolated from other individuals in a population. So maybe a physical barrier like a river or a volcano or something disrupts or divides a population.
Ice age, perhaps?
Ice sheets maybe divide populations into fragments. And if those populations experience different environmental selective pressures, that is different things like predation and competition influencing them, then those populations can diverge from one another genetically and behaviorally. So if they come back together then, so maybe the ice sheet melts and they come back together, then theoretically those populations have diverged in isolation and can no longer reproduce when they come back into contact. Now, in the biological world, we see a gradation of the ability of species to what we call hybridize. For instance, some species are so separated through evolutionary time they can no longer hybridize. A human and a house cat, for instance, would not produce a viable
What do you mean
offspring.
when you're saying hybridize?
Produce a species that's between those two species
like
that are mating.
Like a horse and a mule?
Right,
mating?
so exactly, that's the point I'm getting at. So some species are so isolated in time and have been divergent for so long they can't interbreed and produce anything. They're so incompatible. Other species, like a horse and an ass, are relatively recent evolutionary lineages from the same family. They can still come back together. They're similar. They certainly both look horse-like. They can reproduce, make an organism that we call a mule, but the mule's a genetic dead end because they're sterile. So you can see a gradation of the ability of species to hybridize based upon how long they've been separated in evolutionary time. So things that are recent descendants from a main lineage may still be able to interbreed back if they come into contact with one another.
How does the words natural selection and survival of the fittest fit into the whole theory of evolution?
Yeah,
and where did they come from?
Okay, survival of the fittest is actually comes out of the work by an English essayist named Thomas Malthus. He was an essayist in the 17th century in England, and he was a political commentarist, and he would write about what he saw in the streets of England, that is the overpopulation of the poor. And what he said was that clearly most populations can't sustain this kind of growth and they will struggle to survive. And this sort of idea that there's this survival of the fittest, this kind of misconception of this phrase, survival of the fittest, actually stems from a misconception of the word fitness. In common vernacular, most people think when you say the word fitness or fittest, they think of physical fitness, a strong person that's been working out. But in biology, fitness means the relative reproductive output of an individual in a population. They're two very different meanings. So in evolution, when you're saying
rabbits considered very fit?
Potentially, yes. So when you're saying the survival of the fittest, what we're referring to is which individuals in a population or which genotypes produce the most offspring relative to others in the population. We're not saying they're the most physically fit. That's not what it means. And that's part of the problem, is using common words that have different meanings in science and the confusion that can occur, just like between a hypothesis and a theory, for instance.
Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about creationism. Okay. And has that morphed into something called intelligent design? And I know you know, and our viewers know, that the ACLU has been involved and others have been involved in some legal cases, the most recent one in Dover, Pennsylvania, regarding the intelligent designers and what they wanted to do in the public high school science class. I'm a big free speech guy and all for the debate, as it were, but I don't know that we would teach in a cooking class how to build a waffle iron. So I question whether or not we should teach somebody's deeply held spiritual religious beliefs in a public high school science class. I'm not opposed to beliefs and whatever people come to in terms of making their lives more comfortable and their view of the afterlife or whatever their beliefs are. That's fine. But there is probably a time and a place for the debate to be best held. How do you view the intelligent designers relative to the theory of evolution and that whole debate, as it were?
Okay. That's a good question. Clearly, it's no pun intended, but the tactics of creationists have evolved over the last 100 years. Back in the early part of the 20th century, there were actual laws that banned the teaching of evolution in secondary schools in America, in many states. Tennessee's the classic example, the Scopes monkey trial. When those laws were found to be unconstitutional by promoting one religion in a science classroom, then the tactic changed from banning evolution completely to then promoting what are called balanced treatment acts in places like Louisiana and Arkansas in the 80s. Those were again found to be unconstitutional, and then the next tactic was to change, and instead of promoting any religion, removing all mention of evolution from science classrooms in the age of the earth, which is what happened in '99 in the Kansas school board case. And then lastly, once those were found again to be untenable and unconstitutional, then the next stage was the movement towards intelligent design theory. And that really is sort of the most latest permutation of the creationist view, but you have to remember that many intelligent design theorists, as they call themselves, are not young Earth creationists. They view themselves as being very distinctly different from those kinds, other than they both think that the Earth was created by a higher being. But they often, and one of the fears for me at least, with intelligent design is it at least sounds more scientific to the general public. And of course, the central problem with intelligent design, although there are many problems with intelligent design, but the central problem is that its core tenet is that God created everything, and that's not testable by science, which makes the whole area of intelligent design fall down scientifically.
And when we have serious conflicts in this country, we go to the public square and try to talk them out, and I'm a big proponent of that. That's why I want everybody to come to Science Under Siege, the attack on evolution. Whether you're a believer in evolution or disbeliever in evolution, or know for a fact that evolution exists but has flaws, but we don't ever totally disprove a theory, or you're a creationist or an intelligent designer, we're going to have the discussion. So I want folks to show up. But when we have a dispute in the public venue, such as public schools, we go to courts to settle them. And one of the things that the court opinion in the Dover case said, I'm going to read from it, says, "We have addressed the seminal question whether intelligent design is science," which is part of what the issue has been. Is that science? We have concluded that it is not, and moreover, that intelligent design cannot uncouple itself from its creationists and thus religious antecedents. And since we have this separation of church and state, or we're supposed to have separation of church and state in this country, as evidenced by the First Amendment, where we have the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause seemingly competing with each other, suggesting that the government should remain neutral on matters of religion, not promote one religion over another religion, or religion over non-religion or non-belief, we had this issue. And the court unequivocally rebuked the intelligent designers. But that's not to say they don't have a point in terms of their belief, is it?
Sure, of course not.
Would you disparage in any way their belief in some public manner?
Not at all. Where I have a problem is trying to promote it as science. As the court found, it's not science. And many of the people I work with at the university who are biologists and clearly recognize the evidence and the facts of evolution are practice one faith or another.
All right. Well, Tony, you've been a good guest, a great guest. I appreciate your insights. We're all struggling. We're all learning as we go. That's the nature of science. I'll see you November 13th, if I don't see you before that, at the University of North Florida. My name is Ken Hurley. You've been watching a program called Civil Discourse. Thank you, Tony. We'll see you next time. You have been watching a public access television program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. The ACLU is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. Our mission is to protect and advance the civil liberties and civil rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, especially the principles contained in the Bill of Rights. We want to hear from you. Send us an email, share your views and opinions. If you're interested in appearing on the program, let us know. Friend or foe, we want you on the show. You may contact the ACLU in the following ways. Our telephone number is 904-396-5242. Our post office box is 5331 Jacksonville, Florida 32247, and our email address is aclujax@yahoo.com. My name is Ken Hurley. Thank you for participating in Civil Discourse.
watching Local Access, Channel 29, exclusive programming for Comcast subscribers.
Welcome to The Turning Point, a show about education and literacy on Florida's First Coast. I'm Dr. Gail Florence Kane, president of the DePaul School of Northeast Florida, and here representing the Literacy Council of Jacksonville. Today I am honored to have a guest who has such a vast experience and knowledge of the field of education. I'd like to welcome Dr. Atwal